Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Jake Jacobs, and welcome to part 3 of Mob Rule, Unmasking the Radical Left. You know, when I wrote the book Mob Rule, actually one of the chapters I was working on, it was the 4th of July. It was early in the morning on the 4th of July, but before I actually started writing, I have a little time with the Lord, a little quiet time. I love to read the Psalms, and then I go into social media. And I noticed something in social media that grabbed my eye right away. It was a meme that was put out by a guy even a lot shorter than I am. The meme was Robert Reich. And the meme was dealing with actually one of my heroes, a guy by the name of Frederick Douglass, one of the great minds in American history, Frederick Douglass. After Abraham Lincoln, probably Frederick Douglass is one of my favorites, one of the great intellects. He was an escaped slave, an ex-slave, taught himself how to read and write, was a brilliant writer, a great orator, one of the great American speech givers. And so I noticed when this meme came out by Robert Reich, and some of you may not remember who he is. He used to be the Secretary of State under Bill Clinton. Guy like maybe about that high, makes me feel tall, right? And the meme was dealing with the 4th of July, the rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to us. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. So I saw that, and I went in to look on Robert Reich's Twitter account and his Facebook, and I saw that he had put that out, and he was kind of like, hey, you know, this look America, it's the bad and the ugly, right? Well, then I noticed that Colin Kaepernick had come out with a similar meme that was actually quoting from the great Frederick Douglass. So I started to notice a pattern, because then when I went back into social media, I saw some colleagues of mine that were putting out this stuff from Frederick Douglass. In fact, it was like a 7-minute video done by NPR, National Public Radio, and it was the great-great-grandchildren of Frederick Douglass. And so I watched it. And my colleagues would put this out, and they'd say, hey, here's just a quick 7-minute thing on the 4th of July to remember what a rotten country America is, et cetera, et cetera. I'm thinking, whoa, I love the 4th of July. I love my country, and now you're telling me on the 4th of July that it's an evil country, and you're using one of the guys that I adore, Frederick Douglass. So I watched it, and then it started to make me remember a few things. And what had happened is, after I watched this 2020 NPR version of this small part of a Frederick Douglass speech, the speech was given on the 4th of July back in 1852, is it reminded me of something that I had used in the classroom previous years. And sure enough, after I did some research, I come to find out that I had been using in the classroom, and I'll explain in more detail what I mean. Howard Zinn had, in the year 2004, put out a 5-minute, short little 5-minute thing from Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech, where Frederick Douglass talks about what a bad country this is, and how they can't celebrate the 4th of July like the rest of America. It's very interesting to note that this Marxist professor cherry picks this piece out of Frederick Douglass's speech, and then it was done with the voice of James, who's the guy from Star Wars? James Earl Jones. Yeah, I just forgot. Sorry about that. Thanks, Luke Skywalker, for helping me out on that one. So right away I went, oh, I've heard this speech before. And what I had done in the classrooms, I would play this 2004 version, which was a lot like the 2020 version, of a very short part of the Frederick Douglass speech. And then I would say to my students, okay, now what we're going to do is we're actually going to go into the full speech that he gave back in 1852, right, his 4th of July speech, and we're going to analyze that speech. By the way, the full speech wasn't 4 minutes or 5 minutes, it was 66 minutes. So what Robert Reich, Colin Kaepernick, and what these left-wingers were doing is they were taking about 6% of this amazing speech, and they were truncating it, pulling it out of context to only show the bad and the ugly. By the way, I got to come back to this too. I can't forget this. You know, I showed you that picture of Colin Kaepernick with with Frederick Douglass, right? I don't know if a lot of you people know the background of Colin Kaepernick. He's from my home state of Wisconsin. He was born in Milwaukee. He was actually adopted by white parents, and they ended up living in Fond du Lac. His mother was white, his father was black. And he lived in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin until about the age of 4. His grandparents only live about 20 miles away from here in New London, Wisconsin. Wonderful grandparents, wonderful parents. He has white siblings. When he was a little kid, he wanted to either play for the Green Bay Packers or the San Francisco 49ers. He loved Brett Favre. And then his family moved to California when he was 4, and he started to get a California influence. He ended up having a girlfriend that graduated from UC Berkeley. He ended up taking, when he was drafted by the San Francisco 49ers, ended up going to school and taking classes by the Marxist professors, a number of Marxist professors at UC Berkeley, and it began to shape his worldview, where he began to cop a real negative attitude towards his country. By the way, it's not a coincidence that his girlfriend was a Muslim who started to teach some very anti-Semitic, anti-Israel things. Remember, a lot of times you'll find there's a anti-Judaism, anti-Semitic thing going on here in the world of Islam and in the world of the radical left. They're strange bedfellows who join together as an unholy alliance to attack our Judeo-Christian roots. But I bring up the Colin Kaepernick background because we know what Colin Kaepernick was involved in, and how there's really a Colin Kaepernicking of American culture. That has gone into organizations like Black Lives Matter and others. But now, back to Frederick Douglass's speech. So I'm seeing these memes and this truncated, real short part of the speech. And so I remember even sharing with my students, I go, guys, let's talk about this speech. There were 4 parts of the speech. In the introductory part of Frederick Douglass's speech, he talks about the wisdom of the founders of America. He talks about the greatness of the founders of America. He even calls them their fellow Americans. Then, and by the way, he talks about the greatness of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he talks about, look, these are some of the most sublime, beautiful words ever penned by man. And those are good things for those who actually can experience liberty and equality. He says, then in the second part of his speech, he rightfully says, but we're a bunch of hypocrites. You preach life and liberty and equality, but you don't give it to black Americans. And so he rightfully says, what do I have to do with the 4th of July? Then you go into part 3 and part 4, and what does he do? He says, but I'm not giving up on this great country. In fact, in the early part of Frederick Douglass's career, he was actually very anti-Constitution guy. And then a couple of people had said to him, look, Frederick, why don't you study in the historical context the Constitution? You may come away with a different understanding. And he did. He went, this is a magnificent document, an absolutely glorious and wonderful document. It's why when you hear Martin Luther King in his I Have a Dream speech talk about the magnificent words of the Declaration of Independence or of the Constitution of the United States, he's getting those ideas from his own study of the Declaration and Constitution, but also Martin Luther King studied Frederick Douglass. And here's my point. At the latter part of his speech, he calls our government glorious. In fact, in the end of the speech, it's all in capital letters. It's absolutely wonderful. He calls it the Glorious Liberty Document. So here's my point. When Robert Reich and Colin Kaepernick and Black Lives Matter and all these lefties put out on social media this propaganda, this truncated, ripped out of context propaganda, you can see exactly what they're doing. They're painting once again a bad and ugly narrative that is not accurate. It's not accurate. Yes, there are kernels of truth of what they're saying at that time period in history, but it was a black man by the name of Frederick Douglass working with a white man by the name of Abraham Lincoln that were actually working in tandem to eradicate democratic systemic slavery. In fact, Frederick Douglass's 2 boys were in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which was an all-black regiment. Remember, we talked about the Tuskegee in World War II, an all-black regiment that fought to end democratic systemic slavery during the Civil War. So I think this is something that we need to recognize, that there's a lot of distortion and perversion of historical reality out there. And it comes from individuals who have been shaped by Marxists. Remember, Karl Marx says one of the first battles that we have in the world is to rewrite history, is to pervert history. And this is what's happening in America when these Marxist socialist professors are indoctrinating our young people with twisted history, with twisted narratives, whether it be the mind of Colin Kaepernick, whether it be the minds of the leaders of Black Lives Matter. And it's most unfortunate in this country. And by the way, speaking of bad history, is a project called Project 1619. Project 1619. Now you'll see on the screen here, you'll see where it has the 4th of July crossed out, and then it has August 20th, 1619. Well, in the 400th anniversary of August 20th, 1619, in the year 2019, there was a lady by the name of Nikole Hannah-Jones. And Nikole Hannah-Jones won a Pulitzer Prize for an essay that she had written that went in through the New York Times. And they literally spent millions and millions of dollars on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media components, magazines, and things related. She wrote an article about America wasn't founded in 1776 in the 4th of July, but it was founded in August of 1619. When those slaves landed in America. By the way, it's very interesting to note that Nikole Hannah-Jones, by the way, who calls herself the Beyonce of journalism, right? Remember when Beyonce was dancing half naked at the Super Bowl, pretending that she was a Black Panther lady with all of her friends doing this? You could see, once again, it's in the culture. But this Nikole Hannah-Jones, who calls herself the Beyonce of journalism, she wouldn't tell you that when the slaves came here, they actually were originally enslaved in Africa by Africa chieftains, because that wouldn't fit this 1619 project scenario that's out there, this very bad and ugly narrative that she teaches. And I think it's interesting to note, by the way, when you talk about Nikole Hannah-Jones and her so-called reframing of our history, she's not only reframing our history, she's perverting our history. She's taking little pieces of truth, kernels of truth, and then she's extrapolating them into a bogus, bad and ugly narrative about how horrible we are, how systemic racism is in our DNA. And the curriculum for the 1619 project is now in well over 4,500 classrooms, and their goal is to get really thousands and thousands more. What's interesting to note, by the way, about her winning the Pulitzer Prize, which to me is a bunch of hooey anyways, because usually it's a bunch of left-wing claptrap. It makes me think of Walter Duranty. I don't know if many of you know of Walter Duranty. There's the Walter Duranty, I think there might be a Walter Duranty Harvard Law School or Harvard School Award. Walter Duranty was a New York Times reporter back in the 1930s. And he had an affinity towards Marxism. And he had heard a story that Joseph Stalin was killing, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Ukrainian people. And he comes back to America and he says, that's not true, it never happened. He knew it was true. He lied to the American people. He actually lied to the European press too. He lied because in his worldview, he thought that Joseph Stalin was going to usher in this great, Soviet system that would bring utopia to the world, like so many left-wing professors and left-wing poets and left-wing artists thought Joseph Stalin was going to do. Even like I mentioned last time, the founder of the ACLU, Roger Baldwin, fell for that claptrap. My point is saying is she wins the Pulitzer Prize, so what? I mean, and when you actually, as I mentioned in the book, when you actually go in to her essay, she claims, by the way, like I said, she won't tell you about the African sin on the other end over in Africa, but she claims that American society, that our police force were actually originated by slave catchers. So slave catchers that were, looking for fugitive slaves that were coming up into the north, that's the actual origin of the police force. That's absolute lie, a distorted lie. Then she talks about how evil, they go on Project 1619, how evil white capitalism is. And they say that slavery was really the origin of capitalism because, you know, those slave masters down in the South, they had lots of capital. Now, I think this is fascinating when you study this because when you think of classic liberalism, when you think of Adam Smith and Ricardo and many of the great classic liberal economists of 1776 and the late 1700s or early 1800s, you find that they talk about free enterprise within a free democratic society, not within an enslaved society. So really, when you have people like Alexis de Tocqueville and other foreigners coming over to America, they said it was like night and day. When you went through the North, you saw free enterprise. You saw the prosperity in the freedom of the North. They said, but when you went into the South, you could feel, you could taste the oppression of slavery. It wasn't capitalism in the South. It was slavery in the South. It was chattel slavery where white supremacists, democratic white supremacist slave masters, slave owners, were controlling individuals and reaping the rewards of their labor. That's not free enterprise capitalism. It's one of the reasons Abraham Lincoln's father took him out of Kentucky and the slave state Kentucky and took him into Illinois so he wouldn't have to deal with the competition of what was going on in a slave country, slave state like Kentucky. And by the way, I think it's interesting to note that when Abraham Lincoln, as a young man, went down to New Orleans and saw a slave exchange or a slave auction, he was absolutely appalled by what he saw. Then putting coconut over their bodies to make them look good for the market. The basing inhumanity that was thrown upon, almost like they were animals or pieces of meat. And he saw their humanity, and at a young age is when he recognized and realized something's got to be done. We cannot remain half slave and half free in this country. And I go through in the book in great detail about the courage and the challenge for America to destroy democratic systemic slavery, and then eventually democratic systemic Jim Crow and democratic systemic lynching, democratic systemic separation of marriage contracts up till 1967 in the land. By the way, if you ever watched the movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner with Sidney Poitier and Katharine Hepburn, it's an absolutely wonderful movie dealing with a black man who comes home to a white liberal home in San Francisco and how he reacts. It's Spencer Tracy, who's the father, and how this liberal from San Francisco reacts at first to a black man who's going to marry his daughter. But at that point, it's still, you could not have blacks and whites married in this country because the Democrats had put it within our institutions. And we destroyed that. We stopped that. So I cover that quite a bit in my book. I think it's very interesting, by the way, if you see the quote, when President Trump came out against 1619 Project over the summer, and he called it ideological poison. And of course, as you know, he was attacked as a Nazi, as a fascist, as a racist, one of the most pro-minority presidents in our history. A lover of the Jews in Israel, low black unemployment, Hispanic unemployment, unbelievable prison reform for blacks and Latinos and whites, honoring the Tuskegee Airmen, like I said earlier. His track record with minorities is absolutely wonderful, and yet he was attacked because he dared to say, wait a minute, Project 1619 is a very falsified history, and they want to permeate this throughout our schools, and he called it ideological poison. The president was absolutely spot on, just like he was spot on when he said, you know, they're coming for Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson now, but they're going to start coming for Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. I mean, stop and think of it. The capital of my nation is, of my state, my state is called Madison. It's named after James Madison. What about Washington State? It's named after George Washington. What about our federal capital? It's Washington, D.C. What are they going to do? Rename all of these capitals and all these cities? You know what? They ultimately want to. Just like George Orwell predicted in his book, when that party dictates political correctness in the culture. They'll begin with what they think is a righteous cause, and they will soon go into the world of unrighteousness in their activities. They want to transform and change this nation from the bottom up. So when President Trump brings up this 1619 ideological poison, he was spot on. Remember when, I forget the gentleman's name, he talked about, he says, we should name the riots, what I call the George Floyd riots, when they were rioting in Seattle and Portland, Chicago, Milwaukee, and New York, and Miami, and all across, and Phoenix, and I was there in Scottsdale when they were rioting, and, he says, we should name them the 1619 riots. And Nicole Hannah-Jones said, I proudly wear the badge. Like, I'm proud that they're rioting in the name of social justice. So really what you see here is this advocacy of really despicable history. In fact, by the way, having a PhD in American history, not saying that I'm, one of the top scholars in this country, but that's why I was able to cut right through the deception and lies within this 1619 portrayal of American history. It doesn't mean that all of it is bad, but there are huge sections of it that are very, very much an overdrawn attack against white male figures in American history, ignoring a lot of the great individuals that actually sacrificed, black and whites that sacrificed to achieve the equality that we envisioned in 1776. And by the way, I think it's very interesting to note that just like Black Lives Matter, when they went in and they changed their website, because in there they had comrade, and in there they talked about, ending, being against cisgender males and attacking Western civilization, nuclear family. And now you go in there and it's gone. They know, they got rid of it, they expunged it because they know it was exposing them as the Marxists they are. Same thing is happening with 1619 Project, where now all of a sudden Nicole Hannah-Jones, because a lot of historians, and a lot of them left-wing historians are saying, this is deplorable history. She goes, well, now she goes and says, well, we're not like coming out as historical experts. We're just we're journalists who are writing historical narratives to educate our youth. And no, we really don't think that, it should be the year 1619. I'm here to tell you right now, they're lying. They were lying in August of 2019, and they're lying now as they go through and try to say things that they didn't say, because what they're hoping is that you and I won't take time out to actually remember what they said in the past. They do not want us to know what happened in the past, because when we know what happened in the past, we expose their darkness with the light of historical truth. And so this is happening all over the place. By the way, when you think of this absurd notion, and that I really hope when you get the book, you'll see this coming out, where I really get into specificity of this absurd charge of slavery being capitalistic. Let me give you an example of this. You can see it in America when you cross the Mason-Dixie line, when you go into the South, and you can immediately say, this isn't capitalism, this is chattel slavery going on. No different than if you left South Korea and you went up into North Korea, you would immediately feel the oppression, the grayness, the darkness. And you would recognize and realize, hopefully, the good and the glorious that 36,000 Americans gave the ultimate sacrifice so South Korea could be free. And I have a number of South Korean students who come to this country, come to my classroom. I've got the South Korean flag next to the United States flag, next to the U.S. Army flag and the Marine flag. And I say to those South Korean students, those beautiful young men and women, I say, do you realize why you're free? You're free because of the United States of America. You're free because my best friend's dad in high school, he gave 3 years of his life and had his best friend killed by the communist Chinese or the communist North Koreans. That is oppression. That is evil indoctrination in the communist schools in North Korea versus the freedom that you see in South Korea. And I'm damn proud to say I'm glad to see what America has done. If you get a chance, you go to Washington, D.C., and you see the Korean Memorial where you see our troops in their gear with their guns. And I take a moment out to pray and pray for those soldiers, those veterans, for what they did. I bring up North and South Korea. If you go back to, let's say, the Cold War, compare Eastern Europe to Western Europe. Compare life behind the Iron Curtain and the oppression of Marxism and communism in Romania, Bulgaria, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, all over the oppression, the so-called scientific socialism, which liberates, which is just the opposite. It is totalitarianism, and they had thousands of gulags where literally hundreds of thousands of millions of people were killed, where there was no such thing as freedom of religion, speech, press, and to peaceably assemble, and the right to petition your government like we have in this country. That's the difference. The South was chattel slavery. The North was free enterprise. The East in Europe after World War II was the oppression of Soviet socialism. In the West, because of the United States of America and England, yes, and France, but we were the bulwark of the money, of the blood, sweat, and tears to keep Western Europe free, to create NATO. And when President Trump says it's about time NATO pays more money, you bet it's about time, because we've been paying most of the money for NATO and for the United Nations. So don't you tell me, Nicole Hannah-Jones, that you know anything about the history of this nation. We've done great things. When you think of West Berlin versus East Berlin, the Berlin Wall, when Ronald Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, if you seek peace, tear down this wall. Because that's what Marxism, scientific socialism does. It oppresses, it destroys life and liberty, it constricts liberty. And for you to have the audacity to blame all white men in this country for being evil and that this country is an evil, egregious nation, who are you trying to kid? People are still trying to come in this nation in droves, millions of people from around the world. And they came here after World War II so they could be free. When those Frankfurt Marxist people like Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno, when they left Nazi Germany, where did they go to be free to spew their left-wing Frankfurt School claptrap? They came to America. They came to America and they taught at New York University, at Brandeis, at Madison, at Berkeley, and they were the teachers of Angela Davis, and they had more freedom than they ever had in their lives before. They came here. So don't tell me that this is an evil country and a bad country. Yes, I admit and I teach the evil and the bad, but I will never shy away from letting my students know what a great and glorious country this is. And we have serious problems in this nation right now. We're on the precipice of this nation. If we have any more of these hardcore Ilhan Omar, Rashid Tlaib, AOC, Ocasio-Cortez, if these socialists take over the control of the House, if we lose the Senate to these hardcore leftists, we will see an explosion, an exponential explosion of the federal central government deep swamp like never before. And it's not going to happen on my watch, and it should not happen on your watch, because we do not want these lies to be perpetuated in our schools and our culture, and it's happening. It's in Comedy Central, late night TV. It's all over the place. And we need to be awake to the lies of the wokeness in this country. Geez, I can't believe I'm getting so carried away, but it's just like you realize what's happening right now, and are we awake for what's... my children are millennials. I teach Zoomers. We owe it to them to fight for life and liberty and limited government like our founders envisioned. And for people, black, brown, and all colors in between, we owe it for all of them. I love you guys out there if you're listening to me right now. I love you guys, and I just want to say that this is a great country, and we need to be aware of what's happening right now in this land. And I thank you for taking time out to listen to me. It's about going to wrap up part 3 of Mob Rule, Unmasking the Radical Left. I'm Dr. Jake Jacobs, and we're going to see you guys next time. Ciao.